Hello and welcome back to a Warcraft lore video. This time we're going to be talking about Dire Maul, the city itself, its inhabitants, and basically the full history. So Dire Maul was not always the ruined shell that we see today. About 10,000 years ago, it was the capital of Queen Azshara's highborn, Eldre'Thalas, and it was mainly inhabited by a group of highborn called the Shen'dralar. Now, the Shen'dralar were among Azshara's most favoured subjects, and in turn they were, of course, fully devoted to their queen, as basically all of the highborn were. They were led there by a highborn prince called Tortheldrin. During the War of the Ancients, they came under attack pretty much like everything on the planet. Now, while we do commonly think that the majority of the highborn were in on Azshara's scheme and therefore were completely safe from the Legion, and that is what we think, but realistically, the only elves who were spared from the Legion's assault were those who were inside Azshara's palace. The Shen'dralar were at just as much risk as anyone else, pretty much, and they did actually manage to defend themselves from the Legion's assault. Most likely, though, if it hadn't have been for the shutting of that portal and the end of the assault, the premature end, they probably would have fallen just like the rest of them. So even though the Legion were defeated, things kinda took a bit of a turn for the worse for the Shen'dralar. The shattering heavily damaged the city's buildings and just the walls and pretty much everything, essentially, and furthermore they were very, very far from Malfurion and the rest of Night Elf society. This was both a blessing and a curse. The Highborn in the north were forbidden from using their arcane magic, with the Night Elves basically imposing a death penalty on anyone who would try to use arcane magic. This actually worked out for a decent amount of time, but eventually they did rebel, the Highborn that is. They conjured a giant arcane storm, and, well, this pretty much meant that they were all, they all deserved to be executed under the law. However, Malfurion and the other Night Elves, they just couldn't bring themselves to kill that many of their kin. So instead, they exiled them, and they were exiled all the way over to the Eastern Kingdoms. Now, the Shen'dralar did not have any of these restrictions. They continued to practice their arcane magic, but they did end up suffering some of the same withdrawal that their fellow Highborn in the Eastern Kingdoms would. They were very far south in comparison to where the Night Elves were, and this was far from where the Well of Eternity was. They couldn't really tap into a lot of the energy. This situation slowly got more and more dire until the point where Prince Tortheldrin had to come up with a plan to solve the problem. They ended up constructing 5 giant magical pylons, and what these did was they created a very powerful force field, and they could use this to contain a powerful demon. They ended up summoning in this relatively large demon called Imulthar. He's essentially just a big corehound, and from him they were able to siphon pretty much all of the arcane energy that they needed to stay immortal, keep up their spellcasting, and essentially just be all happy. Unlike their brethren in the Eastern Kingdoms, they lost their immortality, they suffered a lot in terms of pain, and they kind of devolved a little bit. That's why the Blood Elves look different to the Night Elves. They lost their skin tone, it became more sort of orangey, and essentially that's what happened to them. But no, things were pretty much okay for the Shen'dralar. And for thousands of years, this arrangement worked out very, very well. However, as time passed, the amount of energy that was actually needed to maintain this force field started to increase. This got bad, in fact really bad at one point, where they essentially realized that there was just not enough energy to both pass around to all of their people and then actually have enough to maintain these 4 or 5 different pylons to keep the beast enslaved. So once again, the ever-useful Tortheldrin had a solution. He basically decided that there was just too many people, and this is where things take a little bit of a turn for the dark. He culled the population, sparing only his most loyal, and one of the wings of Dire Maul is essentially full of highborn ghosts. These are the dead highborn that were killed by the prince in order to try to just cut down the population so that the drain of magical energy was not as great. Interestingly enough, though, the prince and his followers are actually neutral to players. The NPCs give us some insights into what they currently do, with the zealots complaining about missing books, and the prince himself talking about sharing stories with players. Back in the day, there was actually a whole bunch of class quests, and you could put trade in these class books for a rare trinket. So that's actually the main story of Dire Maul, and the explanation of one of its 3 wings. Overall, basically they culled the population and then they just stayed there for a very long time, keeping themselves to themselves. Next up we have one of the other wings. It contains the Gordok Ogres. And really there is not much in the way of lore for the Gordok Ogres. It seems more like they just decided it would be a pretty good idea to live there because, hey, it's kind of defendable, I suppose, and they decided to settle there. The only interesting thing about them is that their leadership style is kind of cool. Basically, if you want to become the king, you declare that you are the king, and you kill anyone who disagrees, which usually includes the current king. Once you do that, everyone else thinks you're the king, and this actually plays into how the instance, plays out. Then there is the last wing, which contains demonic forces. They were led there by a satyr called Zevrim Thornhoof, and he told the Legion that he could enslave the ancients in Eldre'Thalas. His own power, however, was not enough. He ended up sacrificing countless animals and other living beings at his altar, harvesting their energy in their final moments and then storing it. And eventually, he was successfully able to enslave ancients and a few other things. Then, of course, a few other beings ended up in that wing who are allied to them, and they serve as the other bosses. But essentially, it's mainly full of some elementals and basically just a lot of the fauna, more the flora, actually, of Eldre'Thalas that have been enslaved by him and are bound to his will. So you think that these three very, very different groups would basically be trying to murder each other, and while I'd imagine that they did fight at some point, it does seem that there is now some sort of tenuous truce between the three of them. I guess none are amazingly powerful, and they know that it would be kind of mutually assured destruction thing, and honestly, because so many of these villains are ultra selfish, I guess, then they just want to keep themselves to themselves. As for the Shen'dralar, they seem to be extremely reclusive. Basically, they don't really care much for the outside world, and they are basically just lost to their books. Anyway, let's talk about the bosses themselves. So first up, I'm going to cover the Demon Wing, and the first person there is Lethendrius, something like that. Look, there's a lot of names in this place, and some of them are perhaps a little bit phoned in, I'll just say that. Anyway, she is a blood elf, and she travelled there in search of a source of power, and she's been harvesting energy using an arcane web. Really, she's just a regular filler boss, and she's probably responsible for a few of the demons that are around the place. Then we have Hydrospawn. This is basically just an elemental that was corrupted by Zevrim. Under Zevrim's altar, there was this pool of water with an elemental in it, and over time he tormented the elemental just more and more and more, and then bound it to his will. Now Hydrospawn basically just defends the place. Then we have Zevrim, who we've already covered, and despite being the main lore guy, he actually isn't the final boss. The final boss is Alzin the Windshaper. He wants to corrupt the entire of Eldre'Thalas, and basically so far he's been able to corrupt a decent amount of ancients, but really he hasn't been successful in spreading that corruption around the entirety of the zone, which is obvious because the zone is basically fine. Then we move on to the Ogre Wing. First we have Moldar. He is convinced that the king gave him a pair of enchanted gauntlets. In reality, the king just threw them away and he found them, but regardless, Moldar has reigned as the arm wrestling champion of the Gordok for 6 years. Very impressive guy. Next we have Krieg. He is basically a drunk that gets really angry when people wake him up. And then we have Fengus. Poor old Fengus. He was promised by the king that he would meet his perfect mate if he would just keep his post. And Fengus is a smart man, so he never has left his post. I'm sure he'll meet that mate sometime. Then we have Slipkick. See what you did there, Blizzard. And he is a very sly and also very lazy fellow. He wants to kill the king and overthrow him, but without lifting a finger, so he's been tinkering around the place with traps and things like that, but has not successfully killed the king yet. Then we have Crush. He is just a regular boring guard ogre, there's nothing special about him. Then we have Chorush, who is the king's advisor. There's nothing really special about this guy, but the king thought he would be twice as useful because he had 2 heads. Maybe it's true. You know what? Maybe he was right. And then there's the king himself. Basically, one day, this guy gathered a few of the strongest ogres as followers and overthrew the previous one. So much blood was spilled that the ogres called it the Day of da Blood. So, yeah, that's a thing. And one of the few fun things about this is after you kill the king, everyone else treats you as the current king. Hell, even Chorush will apologize to you if you kill the king before you kill him. Anyway, then we have the Highborn wing. So first of all, there is Magister Kilindris, and he was alive and actually participated in the culling of his people, but during the culling he was mortally wounded, and now his spirit roams around the halls of the city trying to protect it from outsiders. Then we have Tendris Warpwood. Over the years, the corruption of the whole area basically just slowly infected this ancient and broke his mind, so he now stands guard at his post. Then we have Ileana Ravenoak. She was once one of the prince's most valued hunters, but, well, she refused to slaughter the rest of her people, and in return the prince killed her, killed both of her pets, and bound her spirit to Dire Maul, where she is essentially trapped and forced to defend the place. Then finally, the proper boss, the main end boss in this instance, is Imanthal himself, the large corehound whose energy has been siphoned for thousands of years by the Shen'dralar. Yeah, so that's really it. The prince is also there, and the rest of the Shen'dralar, and honestly, I'd recommend killing the lot of them because they're probably complete dicks. Anyway, that's it for this video. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.